All right, everyone, let's begin by welcoming you all to our webinar this evening. It's called Teaching All Sides of History, New Trends in Indigenous Education. We are glad to have you all here this afternoon. I am your host, Jessica Hayes. I am an active classroom certified trainer, and our presenter this afternoon is Carol Warren. Carol has taught for over 25 years in Sakatyn Public Schools on the Gila River Indian community in Arizona. After teaching, she worked as the K-12 Social Studies Specialist at the Arizona Department of Education for 6 years. She's also taught social studies method courses for Arizona State University and Northern Arizona University and Arizona history at Phoenix Community College. In retirement, she enjoys volunteering for the Arizona Geographic Alliance and the Indigenous Education Community of the National Council for the Social Studies. So now I'm going to turn over this session to Carol.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing best practices for teaching about contemporary Native and Indigenous cultures. Specifically, got something in there. Specifically, I'm going to discuss resources which will guide students in the recognition of sovereign Indigenous nations and homelands, such as the A'atham, on whose Indigenous lands I reside, and of the adverse impact of colonization on the lives of Indigenous cultures still today. This is our agenda. I'm going to be sharing a map for identifying Indigenous lands. We'll be discussing Indigenous lands in North America colonized by European nations. However, much of what we discuss is applicable to other countries around the world where European nations colonized Indigenous populations. We're going to look at primary sources, which provide the Indigenous voice and perspective and where to locate them. And we'll do an activity, and then we'll finish up by discussing why understanding and recognizing Indigenous sovereignty is important when you are teaching about contemporary Indigenous cultures. Our first step is to help students recognize Indigenous lands and understand Indigenous sovereignty. Our starting point is going to be this map, Our Homes on Native Land. Now, this is an interactive map showing lands, languages, and treaties for Indigenous groups in many areas of the world. Now you can see that not all Indigenous groups are shown, especially in certain continents, but the map is a work in progress and they're constantly adding more Indigenous groups. And it doesn't, but however, remember, it does not intend to represent official or legal boundaries of where Indigenous lands were. I'm going to go to the map for just a minute here. And I've read the disclaimer. So as we can get over here to make it a little smaller. So you see that the map has no actual line boundaries. Well, the map makers point that out, that there are no clear dividing lines between homelands, because Indigenous people lived with the land. So as you see, and if I can get, I think I've got all of the world there. North America and South America are very well represented, and they were definitely had Indigenous people here when the colonists first came. And later, you're going to have an opportunity to explore that map. Here, I need to get, we've got something else up here. So next, the students need to understand events and actions that severely altered Indigenous life in the past. So overall, that is loss of lands, natural resources, language, and traditional way of life. Specifically, we're looking at quite a long list, and this is probably not even all of them for sure. New diseases which decimated the tribes, reduction or removal from the homelands and tribal lands, forcing them onto reservations, loss of water rights and the other natural resources that were needed to continue their way of life. And that could include also hunting and fishing and gathering rights. The forced removal, or I'm sorry, repeated attempts to destroy Native culture by the government, and that included tribal languages and boarding schools. Now, many of these forced changes that you see and assimilation actions began actually in federal legislation. The Civilization Fund Act of 1819 funded missionaries and church leaders to establish schools in Indian Territory in order to teach the children to replace their tribal practices with Christian practices. And eventually, of course, this leads to the boarding school era, which we'll actually talk about later. So we all know the value of using primary sources in our classrooms, and I have highlighted three that are of, I think, particular importance in providing the Indigenous voice and perspective, both in the past and the present. So we could have our students use primary sources to identify these actions and that severely altered Indigenous life in the past, and then use that information to help them better understand issues and problems which exist today. Oops, there we go. So what types of primary sources can students use? Well, oral traditions are an especially important source for providing the Indigenous voice and perspective. They are one of the few records of the Native view, and it might come in the forms of stories or songs and chants and tribal histories. So artifacts, historic maps, historic photos. Now, they were sometimes staged, but they still have value in showing aspects of life in the past. The drawings, early contact accounts, and government documents, definitely students may need guidance in evaluating those for their perspective, any bias and inconsistency. So next we're going to look at examples of these types of primary sources. So I feel it's important for students to know that even though Indigenous tribes did not have written records, they did have ways to record events. Indigenous stories and history may be available through the tribal website of the websites of individual tribes, such as this example from the Oneida Indian Nation. It relates their roles as allies in the Revolutionary War. It was commemorated with the Canandaigua Treaty. And in the middle, we see an example of a wampum belt that George Washington had made and presented to the Confederated tribes to represent the treaty alliance. So wampum belts are visual memory keepers that were used by Northeastern tribes that helped record their history. Beaded patterns would represent a person, a nation, or even an event or an agreement. So the words that were spoken during a treaty, for example, the one with the United States, could later be used for teaching and reminders of laws and values. At the bottom, you see a photo of Iroquois chiefs from Six Nations Reserve reading and explaining their wampum belts to an anthropologist. Now, anthropologists and ethnologists were sometimes sent out, but often went sometimes on their own, but they lived with Indigenous tribes and recorded information. And their reports are actually quite informative, and they're available at the National Anthropological Archives, and some are available in print or online. Two additional tribal methods of recording history are shown on the left. You're probably familiar with winter counts of the Great Plains tribes. They're pictographs painted on hide, cloth, or paper, and they record their history. The tribal leaders would choose the most memorable event of a year to add to the hide, and thereby you had a history of the tribe. Now, a winter count keeper would then use that pictograph to remember and retell the events marked in a year. Now, bottom on the left here is a detail from this winter count, and I want you to note the figure that's covered in small red dots. This pictograph recounts how smallpox devastated the continent. It's a highly contagious disease, particularly devastating to the Indigenous population, killing a majority of all those who contracted it. And it was, of course, brought by the Europeans. To the right, we have the calendar sticks of the southwestern O'odham tribes. Calendar sticks are also mnemonic devices that record memorable events. Elders in the O'odham tribe scratched designs and figures on saguaro cactus ribs to record the events of importance during the owner's lifetime. Now we have records from events of events from 1833 to 1902 from calendar sticks, which were retold, translated into English, and then recorded by anthropologist Frank Russell in his report of his stay in 1901 and 02. And the translations are available in the book, The Pima Indians by Frank Russell, and that's also available online. So calendar sticks did not record every event that affected the lives of the Akamila, but they do provide insight into changes. So for example, we saw on the calendar sticks that they recorded the consequences of the loss of Gila River water on the Gila River Atham, historically known as the Pimas, who were very successful desert farmers. They used irrigation to farm. However, unfortunately, in 1868, the Anglo settlers upriver began diverting Gila River water. And also published sources such as stories, translations of legends, and reminiscences are also available, such as these three from my library. So they're about the Akamila, two by Anna Moore Shaw, Pima Indian Legends, and a Pima Past, and one by George Webb, A Pima Remembers. So that, again, this would probably possibly be available in any area of the country that you were interested in studying. So we're going to look at photos. The first one, where you see the photographer and also the horse and wagon, that is the Gila riverbed. That's the dry Gila riverbed. Now, I just mentioned how they started diverting water. This was about 40 years after they started diverting the water. The Atham at this point were relying on government handouts for survival. So 10 years before this photo in 1895, the situation was so serious that the Pima Indian Agency requested and was given $30,000 per year to purchase wheat for the Pimas. Now, interestingly, this amount of wheat purchased, which was 250,000 pounds, was the same as the excess amount sold to the Overland Mail Company by Pima farmers in 1859, when water still flowed in the river. So you can see the devastating effect of that on them. Now, the update of this photo, in 2004, the Gila River Indian community signed a water agreement with the United States government. And unfortunately, the Gila riverbed is still dry today through the reservation, but water is coming to the Gila River Indian community through canals from the Colorado River. To the right is a photo of a Yurok man in his fishing boat in Northern California near the Oregon border. Now, many of the Northwestern tribes lost fishing rights, and later dam building destroyed fishing areas, especially affecting the salmon. So the update to this photo is that hopefully in 2022, the 4 lower dams on the Klamath River will be removed, and that will free the fish and restore an important cultural and natural resource to the Yurok people. Now, a similar situation is also occurring now on the Snake River, where salmon are also endangered due to dam building. Now, the bottom two picked photos are both of men from the Hopi village of Arribe in northern Arizona. The left one shows them spinning and carding in 1903, which is probably somewhat of a staged photo, but it is accurate. The males were the weavers in this culture. But I'd like you to compare that to the next photo, which was taken 8 years earlier in 1894. This is obviously not posed. The soldiers are guarding 19 Hopi prisoners from Arribe on their arrest in Arizona. The men, which included 2 chiefs, were sent for a year's imprisonment on Alcatraz Island for not sending their children away to a boarding school. Which brings us to the subject of boarding schools. Here again, we see older photos. This is the before and after photos of Chiricahua Apache children at Carlisle Indian School in the mid-1880s. Now, these photos clearly show how the government used education as a tool to assimilate indigenous children away from the influence of tribal life and into the mainstream of the American way of life. So after 4 months, they had completely changed a lot of their tribal ways. The boarding school era lasted from 1860 to 1978. And it wasn't until the passing of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978 that Native American parents finally gained the legal right to deny their children's placement in an off-reservation boarding school. So if you're interested in more information about boarding schools, you can find resources in the Museum of the American Indian, the Library of Congress has some, and even PBS has done a program about that. Now, this Indian Child Welfare Act also ended another method that the government used to assimilate children. That was forcibly removing children, often from intact indigenous families with extended family groups who would probably helped, and placing them in mostly non-indigenous foster homes or adoptive homes. So if you're interested in learning a little more about the foster care placement and non-tribal adoption of indigenous children, I recommend the 2018 documentary film Dawnland, which tells of the devastating impact of the state of Maine's child welfare practices on the Wabanaki people. I'm actually going to go and show you the trailer of this documentary.
Would you like to come up to the witness stand?
They went into my home and picked up my children and placed them in a foster home. This country had official policy to remove Native children from their homes and place them with white families so that they would learn how to be white. But we're still here. And many of our people have never, ever shared their stories. Imagine being torn away from your parents and community.
I remember the station and never talked about it in therapy. It's like video game.
Maine has become the first state in the nation to form a Truth and Reconciliation Commission focusing on child welfare.
The truth hurts, but the truth is very painful.
How come it took so long for you all to get a group together to see if they can help us? You can't hear someone that's going through hell. Usually when a truth can...
So you can see that the damage and the pain from this policy is still affecting victims and their tribes today. And this happened all over the United States. It wasn't just in Maine. I've asked Jessica to, at some point, put the link to Dawnland in the chat. You notice that they do offer a student guide, but I am suggesting this as something for you as the educators to watch and learn about this situation. And then you can consider how you would like to use that if you wanted to use that with your children or even parts of it. I saw it at the NCSS National Council for the Social Studies Conference last year, and it's a very, very moving and upsetting but truthful documentary. Our next resource is historic maps, and they're sometimes helpful when you're trying to identify land loss or removal. I have two here. On the left, I have a detail from the map of Pimaria Alta by Father Kino from 1701, which shows the indigenous home of the Atham tribes, which is labeled Pimaria right down through the middle there. This is Spanish New Mexico, which is present-day southern Arizona. In red, you see the current international border since 1854, which divided the Tohono O'odham tribe. At first, it was a porous border, and they could easily move back and forth for celebrations and ceremonies. But then came a fence, and then came a wall, thus requiring the Tohono O'odham that reside in Mexico to go to a border crossing, which are pretty few and far between in this area of the border. The map on the right was created in 1831, and it's titled showing that part of Georgia occupied by the Cherokee Indians. Now the land was over 4 million acres, contains, quote, many rich gold mines and many delightful situations, and though in some parts mountainous, some of the richest land belonging to the state, end quote. Now I'm sure most of you recognize the timing of this map, as the Indian Removal Act was signed into law in May of 1830. But you can see just from this description why the Indian Removal Act was put into effect. This act authorized the president to grant lands west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders, such as the Cherokee lands in Georgia. So a few tribes went peacefully, but many resisted this relocation. And during the fall and winter of 1838 and 39, the Cherokee were forcibly moved west by the government, and approximately 4,000 Cherokee died on this forced march, and which of course we all know as the Trail of Tears. So maps can be quite helpful if you want to teach a specific part. Now we also have, in contrast to modern maps, that give the Indigenous perspective on sovereignty, place, and displacement. On the left is from the Library of Congress. Poet laureate Joy Harjo has a project titled Living Nations, Living Words. And it's a map of First Peoples poetry. Now it's an interactive ArcGIS story map, which presents a sampling of work by 47 Native Nation poets. So each poet selected an original poem on the theme of place and displacement. Now they're also in the process of creating an educator guide using the poetry, and they did have a committee of both social studies and language arts educators offer information for this. So hopefully it'd be very helpful. But it would be a very unique and good addition to social studies to show how past actions are still impacting contemporary Indigenous cultures. On the right, we have Coming Home to Indigenous Place Names in Canada. It's from the Canadian American Center at the University of Maine. And this map honors Indigenous place names in Canada and the assertion of Indigenous authority through those place names. The names express and assert the Indigenous presence across the Canadian landscapes in Indigenous languages. Now, of course, you could do the same thing with the United States. And actually, I think I have seen some smaller versions. Perhaps it was a couple of tribes or maybe even counties that did this, a very similar thing. But it's quite unique and quite something to add again if you're looking into the geographic place names and how, by giving places names, actually shows that this is their sovereign land. And that's the idea here. Now we, of course, in the United States, we are seeing some changes made from modern geographic place names back to Indigenous names. And I know that you all know that the most common one that we all know is Mount McKinley, back to Denali. Whoops, let's go back. Try it again. There we go. Lastly, we have government documents. There are several types of government records that give information on Indigenous groups. I mentioned the Bureau of Ethnology reports. Also, boundary surveys have some information. Indian agency reports could give you some perhaps tribal speeches and federal statutes. But notice the asterisk, they all need careful evaluation because they are the government documents. There were many harmful laws that affected Indigenous cultures, and I've already mentioned two of them. But I also want to talk about the Dawes Act also known as the General Allotment Act of 1887. So this act allowed for reservation land, which was held in common by members of a tribe, to be broken up into small allotments to be parceled out to individual tribal members. So the parcels could be sold, and of course, unscrupulous individuals took advantage of this, and it resulted in the loss of 60 million acres of treaty land that were open to settlement by non-Indians at very low prices. And it proved disastrous by deteriorating the communal lifestyle of indigenous societies and the loss of natural resources. So it was just another assimilation attempt from the federal government. However, if you're going to bring it into the present, in the last 100 years, there have been some attempts to correct the wrongs, but unfortunately, it was much too late. Of course, we had the Citizenship Act, an Indian Citizenship Act. Civil Rights Act of '65 finally gave everyone, all the indigenous groups, the right to vote. Indian Civil Rights Act, Indian gaming, which helped bring some economic relief to the tribes, and the Native American Language Act, the last one that I'm going to mention, and that's where finally Native children were able to be taught in their own languages rather than in English. So where can we find some of these primary sources? Well, to get the best, to best get the indigenous perspective and voice, go to the tribal websites and the National Museum of the American Indian. Here you'll hear their stories. The museum does have an area that they've put together. It's Native Knowledge 360. It's an education initiative. Library of Congress would have photos and documents. You have to search by tribal name, and sometimes you'd have to use their historic name. So for example, the Pima, which today are referred to as the Atham, you would have to perhaps use both words, both names to find things. The National Archives has put their information into 3 different programs. The Indigenous Digital Archive Treaties Explorer tells about treaties and land cessions, because a lot of tribes didn't have treaties, they had land cessions, and how they've changed over the years. So that would be, if you want to bring that past to the present, that would be something to look at. In Docs Teach, we have their primary sources, and in the Native Communities program, you can search by geographical area to find the communities that might be in your geographical area. Now, I've included the national parks and monuments because they're updating their websites to include the indigenous voice and perspective. For example, the information that I showed you earlier about the Hopi men and the photo both came from the Alcatraz Island National Park website. And last of all, museum and university websites for photos, artifacts, historic map collections. And this would also be very useful if you are looking for information on indigenous cultures in other countries. So now we're going to go to our activity. And I've titled it, "On Whose Indigenous Sovereign Lands is Your School Located?" So we're going to be using this on our homes on native land map that we saw. And you're going to, I'd ask you to search for your school's location using the territory switch. And then down below, and I have a sample here on the right side of the slide, they give you the local nations which you can contact to verify information. And I'd like you to look at those links and see, is the tribal nation still located in your area? If not, see if you can find out where they're located. And if they have a website, do they share any tribal stories or history about them? Now, if links don't lead to tribal websites, and that might be possible depending on where some of you live, consider other ways to locate the information. So this is actually one from Saskatoon where I taught. And you'll see the local nations include the Akamil Atham, who are the tribe now. But these are also other tribes that lived in the area. But the Hohokam are actually the prehistoric tribe that lived in this area, or prehistoric culture, I should say, that lived in this area. And so you're not going to find a local website for them. But there are lots of ways to find information about that. So Jessica is going to put the map link in the chat, and we'll join back together in about 5 minutes. I think I'm going to start asking you to come back to join us again. It's been about 5 minutes. I hope you had some success in finding out who the indigenous cultures were that lived in your area, and maybe some information about them. So I want to finish today by considering why understanding and recognizing Indigenous sovereignty is important when learning or teaching about modern Indigenous cultures. And it's because conflicts weren't only in the past, they're still happening today. A recent example from Australia, we see before and after photos of a Western Australia gorge known for its cave system. That was the only inland site in Australia that showed signs of continuous human occupation for over 46,000 years. It was deliberately destroyed by the Rio Tinto mining company just a year ago. Now, the caves were a sacred site, of course, for the traditional Aboriginal owners of the land. They don't own it anymore. The caves were seen as one of Australia's most significant archaeological research sites, but unfortunately, they had more than 8 million tons of high-grade iron ore in them. Well, there was an outpouring of anger when this was made public, not only in Australia, but in many places around the world. And so the Australian Parliament looked into it, and they actually ordered them to Rio Tinto to rebuild the caves. I know a lot of the artifacts were taken out, but they actually have to restore the site. And at the very bottom on the right, you see the official apology from the Rio Tinto PHB's website. But Australia is not the only location where this happens. Here in North America, not far from where I'm at here, Oak Flat, Arizona, there was a land swap, and this is a fight that's been going on for quite a while over a plan to greatly expand the Resolution Copper Mining Corporation, which is actually a subsidiary of Rio Tinto. And it's been going on for years, as I said. It's a Forest Service recreation area and campground, but it's not on a reservation land. However, it's still considered to be land that's sacred to the Apache. And recently they've announced a hold on this land swap. I believe just a couple of weeks ago, vandals caused irreparable damage to Creek and Cherokee rock carvings in a national forest area of northeastern Georgia. Their special site for the Eastern Band of Cherokee that connects them to their past. We see in South America, when Brazil's president took office, he promised to open the Amazon to mining and farming. But even more distressing, he has started dismantling indigenous rights preserved in Brazil's constitution. And in Europe, the Sami challenges to them include the disappearance of their language and, again, resource and extraction industries on their traditional lands. Just a note about languages, 40% of the estimated 6,700 or so languages that are spoken around the world are in danger of disappearing, and a majority of those are indigenous. In Africa, there was a situation where the Kenyan Forest Service forcibly evicting an indigenous group from a place they have lived for over 200 years. And two examples in Asia, both having to do with extraction industry. In Sumatra, a rainforest area, a planned mine tailings dam that's worrying people. And in the Philippines, they've been putting up with environmental degradation and public health impacts for many, many years from gold and copper mines closure. So you can see that indigenous history, their rights, their lands, and culture are still under attack throughout the world. Now, I've put all this together, if you would be interested in an activity for students to learn about the indigenous cultures on whose land they reside. It's pretty much what we've been doing the last half hour, telling you some of the resources you can use and so on. But I would like to point out numbers 7 and 8, which suggests that the final steps in this activity is to encourage civic action to raise awareness of indigenous concerns and problems. This could be local, statewide, or the country, or the world. And so Jessica is going to post a link in the to this activity in the chat if you're interested in that. So in closing, I hope to have provided some ideas and some resources which help your students recognize and acknowledge Indigenous sovereignty in North America, identify the impact of historical events and past governmental actions on Indigenous life today. It hasn't gone away, it's still there and greatly hurting people. And then consider ideas for taking civic action to raise awareness of Indigenous issues and problems. So I thank you all for joining me, and thank you, Jessica, for your assistance, and hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you, Carol. We do have one question for you.
Okay.
It is from Heidi. She asks if you can talk a little bit more about your process of taking a historic event or a primary source like the water photos and sharing the contemporary events like the canals and dams. How is the information found? How is it part of a lesson, activity, or unit?
Well, I didn't get quite all of that, but I think what she means is how do you tie the past to the present? I myself, while I was still teaching, actually created a lesson using primary sources from the very first, which would have been the Pima. I mean, of the Pimas where I taught, or the Atham, would have been the Spanish. And I wanted my students to understand why the river was dry, why a lot had changed over the years. And so I went through and found the primary sources because they were younger students, and put it together in a lesson that showed how through time, everyone who came to see or visit the Pimas or traveled through their lands commented on what wonderful farmers they were and how friendly they were and so on until the water disappeared. And then some more current tribal chiefs' messages about how we have to change our lifestyle because we no longer have the water and so on. And I put that in a lesson for the students so that they could see on a timeline just how the changes came. And there was a dam built right in the middle, supposedly to help the Atham, but instead it didn't help. It just, kind of dried up again. So that's how I've done that. And that lesson's actually available on the Arizona Geographic Alliance website. It's a free lesson. Just search under my name. But I would first have, as the teacher, depending on the age of your students, I would select what would seem to be some good places to look for primary sources, depending on what the actual outcome you want is. So if you are looking for a particular tribe that was damaged because of water loss or dam building and they're no longer fishing, then go back through history and see when those events happened and then what was the result of that today. Now, I don't know if that helps her or answers her question, but I think that's what she's asking. So I would, as a teacher and educator, just sort of try to find the focus points in what you're trying to do as an end result and make those available or help your students find those.
And I also have a question. If you could, is there a way to contact you in the future regarding this topic?
Yes, I actually have an email still through ASU, so it's carol.warren@asu.edu. And if they would like to contact me, or perhaps they can contact me through Social Studies School Services, if that's a possibility also.
All right. Let's see. Can you please repeat your email one more time and I will put it in the chat box?
Sure. It's carol.warren@asu.edu.
All right. Okay. That looks like all of the questions.
Okay.
Let's see. All right, everyone, this concludes our webinar this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. If there are no more questions, if you would please fill out this quick evaluation that I have posted in the chat box. And once you complete it, you are free to leave. Thank you all so much for joining us.